Through the years, it has been called by many names and euphemisms. The syndicate, the mob, the mafia. But there is only one name that got right to the point. But arguably, the biggest name in the history of Murder Incorporated is also one of the more forgotten names in the pantheon of mafia goons. Abe Reles.
The mob's theory was if there are no informants, nobody could testify against them and they were safe. That worked for about a decade until Abe Reles, the killer in chief, himself became the biggest informant of all.
It was A Brotherhood Betrayed, and that story is now being told with extraordinary detail in a new book by the same name.
You know that old expression, to know where the bodies were buried? He literally knew where the bodies were buried, lots and lots of them. And then the big question became, could the district attorneys keep him alive long enough to testify against the big boss?
That would be a no. But in Michael Cannell's account of the unraveling of Murder Incorporated by its highest-ranking assassin, Abe Reles' death isn't the end of the story. It's the beginning of a mystery and a history, a gritty, true tale of the mob's rise and fall. Michael Cannell, thanks very much for joining us. Appreciate it.
Hey, it's great to be here.
Before we get into the nitty-gritty of the book, I've just got to ask, why are we so fascinated with stories about gangsters? You know, it's like on Thanksgiving, of all holidays. You turn on the TV, the old movie channels are running Godfather marathons every year. And they're horrible people. Why are we so interested in them?
Yeah, I've spent a lot of time thinking about that question, and I wish I had a really definitive answer. The best thing I can say is that mafia stories are like operas or Shakespeare. There's, all of life is in these mafia stories. There's love, there's family, there's tragedy, there's violence, obviously. There are terrible ironies. All of life is in these stories. And I think for Americans, they may hold particular fascination because, ironically, even though these are immigrant stories, these are stories about families that for the most part, came from Sicily and Naples. There's something very American about it. These are families that came here to become American, to make their way in America, to become America. They're immigrant stories. And for that reason, I think that they resonate in some manner.
The main character in your book is Abe Reles, a mobster name that I wasn't familiar with. I don't know how many people are. We all know sort of Lucky Luciano and Dutch Schultz and, et al. But his name wasn't one that's familiar. But what's interesting is that he's the main character of the book. He's a stool pigeon, I guess you'd say, in the vernacular of the mob. And he dies on page 1. And then the whole rest of the book is kind of this murder mystery. As a writer, do you feel like you take a chance when you kill off your main character on page 1?
Yeah, that's another really good question, Paul. That's a really good question. In some interviews that I've conducted for podcasts and radio since the book came out, the interviewer has said, we don't want to talk about what happens at the end of the book because, we don't want to give it away. But of course, I give it away in the first couple of pages. Abe Reles, who was the chieftain of Murder, Inc., was responsible for murdering hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of informants. The mob's theory was if there are no informants, nobody could testify against them and they were safe. That worked for about a decade until Abe Reles, the killer in chief, himself became the biggest informant of all. And he told the police and the district attorneys about hundreds of murders. You know, that old expression, to know where the bodies were buried. He literally knew where the bodies were buried, lots and lots of them. And then the big question became, could the district attorneys keep Reles safe, keep him alive long enough to testify against the big boss? Because everybody knew that Reles's old friends and associates in the Mafia would muster all of their resources to try to kill him under police protection. And in fact, he did go out the window of a hotel and died, the sixth floor window of the Half Moon Hotel in Coney Island. The police called it an escape. Was it really an escape? Almost nobody thinks it was an escape. He did not go out that window voluntarily. The question is, who threw him out the window? And so that's a long-winded way of saying, you know, I don't think that I needed to keep it a secret in the book that Abe Reles was going to die. The suspense, the question, the mystery, the tension is really about how this happened and who actually killed him.
Now, before he took his swan dive, I mean, how much damage did he do as an informant?
Well, not as much as he was about to do. The answer to that question is that he testified in court against his 4 closest associates, his lieutenants, who also happened to be his lifelong friends, his closest childhood friends. He testified against 4 of them. All 4 went to Sing Sing. All 4 died in the electric chair. And the district attorneys were about to have Reles testify against the big bosses, the mob lords, starting with a man named Lepke Buchhalter. And so Reles died just before he was to have testified against Lepke Buchhalter. So the answer is he did quite a bit of damage. He told the police about everything, and there were a lot of prosecutions, but he died before he could bring down the big bosses.
Really, hundreds of murders he helped them clear, I guess.
Well, he told them about hundreds of murders. There were a dozen or so trials, prosecutions. There were not as many as there would have been if Reles had lived a little longer.
Let's talk about Abe Reles. Grew up in Brooklyn. He was Jewish. I point that out because there are sort of 2 different gangs that work together in this, the Jews and the Italians. Both, I would think, were sort of insular communities. Why did they come together?
Yeah, I'll just give you a little bit of kind of background on that. That first generation of old mafia guys who came over from Sicily and Naples, they didn't come to America because they wanted to be Americans. They were really just escaping prosecution and murder charges in Italy. There was no extradition treaty at the time. So if they got to America, they were safe. They had no interest in, watching baseball or drinking American beer. They just stayed Italian in lower Manhattan. They lived in Italy, and they carried on as if they were still in Sicily. They were very parochial, very insular. They wanted nothing to do with Irish gangs, African American gangs, Jewish gangs. But the next generation, everything changed. The generation of Bugsy Siegel and Lucky Luciano, they'd grown up with these Jewish guys. They were their childhood friends. They also, at that point, had begun to think of the Mafia in different terms. They wanted to run it like a corporation. They wanted to run it simply for profit. I mean, Lucky Luciano himself said that he wanted to run the Mafia like General Motors. And he did. He broke it up into franchises all around the country, sort of like McDonald's. And, the way this worked was that the Jews and the Italians were going to work together. When Reles himself was fighting his way up the food chain in Brooklyn, he wanted to overthrow the top mobsters in his neighborhood, the 3 Shapiro brothers. And to do that, he needed a little more muscle. And so he recruited the Italian mobsters from the next neighborhood over, and they formed a Jewish Italian mob. And that was kind of the prototype for the way the mafia worked in the following years. Multi-ethnic, driven for profit.
So Reles works his way up to the point where he's kind of the field general, I guess, of Murder, Inc. Let's talk about Murder, Inc. and what it was. I mean, these are guys, it was like an assassination squad, I guess, and they're sitting around this candy store, I think, waiting for the phone. It's like a phone to ring. It's like a reverse 911. You call the number when you want to commit a crime, and these guys pick up and respond. Tell us about Murder, Inc.
It was really Lucky Luciano's idea, was that if they could kill all the informants, they wouldn't ever be prosecuted. And it worked for a long time. And the reason that it worked was that the big bosses set up this assassination squad, and they chose Abe Reles, this toughest of all thugs from Brooklyn. They chose him to be the head of their assassination squad. They didn't come up with the term Murder, Inc. The newspapers came up with that term. But if a gangster in St. Louis or Chicago or Miami suspected that one of their foot soldiers was talking to the police, they would simply call the big bosses. The big bosses would place a phone call to this candy store where Abe Reles and his men hung out all day and all night. And Abe Reles would dispatch somebody. Sometimes it was him. More often it was one of his lieutenants. They would pack a bag just like any middle management executive. They would pack a bag with a change of clothes and, by the way, a gun and a rope. And they would fly to Cleveland or to Los Angeles. They would kill the offending gang member, and they would get on the next flight back. Usually they'd be back in Brooklyn at the candy store before the police even were rounding up suspects. So it was all done in a very, very efficient and an organized manner. There was nothing messy or passionate about it. It was business.
And yet they sort of took these extreme paths when they killed people. It's like a James Bond movie where you're going, why don't you just shoot him instead of saw him up or whatever? But they all had these elaborate schemes with ice picks and ropes and knives. And why were they so fixed on making these big statements? Maybe that's what it was a statement. I don't know.
Well, there are two answers to that question, I think. Number one is they often wanted the murders, particularly when they were murdering somebody around their own turf in Brooklyn. They wanted the murders to appear really, really grisly, because part of what the murder was about was sending a message to anybody else who would encroach on their turf or anybody who was thinking about informing. So it was important to them. I mean, in that sense, these murders were sort of like theatrical performances. They wanted them to appear in the newspapers, as horrible as possible. The other answer to the question is that some of the guys that surrounded Reles, they were like the kids in class who put their hands up first. They really enjoyed this work. They were really sadistic. And there was one man in particular named Pittsburgh Phil Strauss, who would tie people up in such a way that when they struggled, they would slowly strangle themselves to death. And there are descriptions of him, watching them and giggling as they strangled themselves. So he clearly enjoyed his work. And really, I mean, we could only call him a sadist, I think.
Yeah, so Pittsburgh Phil, Abe Reles was known as Kid Twist. There are all these, I don't want to say great street names in there, but they almost all had one. What was that all about? Was that some way to talk secretly and not be overheard about who they were talking about, or was it just a buddy-buddy kind of thing?
Yeah, the names are incredible. I mean, there was a guy named TikTok Tannenbaum. There was a guy named Charlie Spinach. There was a guy named Pretty Levine. The names are magnificent. But what was that about? I mean, I think it's probably fundamental to any kind of fraternity that you have these names that are different than your normal names. It has something to do with, it's just human nature. I mean, it's part of it is I think that they were all creating personas for themselves that were not really who they were. They wanted to seem tougher and more badass than their normal selves. So they kind of, the names I think represented slightly fabricated personas.
One of them was Gangy Cohen. I'm not sure what Gangy was supposed to stand for, but it's one of the great stories in the book. If it's not giving away too much, tell us what happened with Gangy Cohen.
Yeah, I would say Gangy Cohen might be my favorite character in this book, and there are a lot of characters. Gangy Cohen was dispatched to kill his best friend. That's often the way Murder, Inc. worked. And the logic was that if some stranger comes along and tells you to get in the car, you're not going to do it because you're going to be suspicious. But if your best friend comes along and tells you to get in the car, you're probably going to do it. So Gangy Cohen was sent to the Catskill Mountains in upstate New York to kill his best friend, Walter Sage, who had been stealing profits from the illegal slot machines that were put in resorts and the casinos in upstate New York. And he was with a group of people who stabbed Walter Sage to death with an ice pick in a car as they purportedly went out for a night of drinking. Gangy Cohen had the idea that he was going to be next. And so he ran off into the woods. And nobody knew why he ran off into the woods. It baffled everybody. And then they didn't see Gangy again. A couple of years went by, and nobody knew whatever happened to Gangy. And then one day, two of these gangsters are in a movie theater in Brooklyn, and they're watching a movie about a boxer. And in the climactic scene, the camera pans out over the audience, and there's Gangy Cohen in the audience in the movie. Gangy Cohen had gone to Hollywood. He had taken the Greyhound bus to Hollywood and had gotten movie roles, small parts in movies, playing tough guys, ironically often playing policemen. And he was eventually arrested, tried, and acquitted. And then he went back to Hollywood and he played Hoss Cartwright's body double in the TV show Bonanza for the rest of his life. Gangy Cohen was maybe the only guy for whom this ended well.
So on the other side of the coin, we've got the good guys, although some of them are more good than others. But the one that really seemed like sort of a Boy Scout is Thomas Dewey, a name we know here in St. Louis because of the famous newspaper headline, Dewey Defeats Truman, photograph was taken here in St. Louis at Union Station. Other than that, I think most people have forgotten about Thomas Dewey. But he was a very central figure in prosecuting these guys.
Yeah, I mean, Dewey is just a fascinating person. And as you say, I think most of us only think of him as a punchline associated with that famous photo in which he lost the presidential election. But when he was 35 years old, he was appointed special prosecutor, essentially to bust the mob in New York. And he was the newspapers nicknamed him the Kid Prosecutor. He was only in his mid-30s, and nobody thought he was going to be able to bust the mob. I mean, the mob was so powerful at that time and had made so much money that they were bribing not just the local patrolmen on the street, but police officials, judges, district attorneys, higher-ranking city officials. The mob was so entrenched. But Dewey managed to make some important prosecutions, in part by starting with the prostitutes. He raided the brothels, and he gave the women in the brothels a choice. They could either go to jail for a long time, or they could say what they knew about the mob bosses who ruled these houses of prostitution. Many of them chose to go to jail. Some of them chose to testify. at a time when nobody wanted to testify because of Murder Inc. Anybody who testified was under an immediate death threat. But that's how Thomas Dewey began his career, not just as a prosecutor, but of course, like many prosecutors, busting the mob was, an important stepping stone to a political career.
What were a person's odds if they testified against the mob? What was the sort of squealer to dead person ratio?
How would you handicap somebody's health after they? I mean, I couldn't say statistically, but when the women were being held in custody after Dewey raided these houses of prostitution, they talked very openly about how they would rather go to jail because they knew that the moment they were out on the street again, that Murder Inc. would get them. So they, for what it's worth, they felt like it was pretty much a done deal that they would die.
One of the great locations in the book is the aforementioned Half Moon Hotel in Coney Island, where they had what came to be known as the Rat Suite, where all these squealers were holed up. It wasn't really a jail, but they weren't really free to come and go either. What was the situation at the Rat Suite?
Yeah, I mean, these gangsters who most prominently Abe Reles was part of this group, but there were 5 or 6 others who were gangsters who became informants. The witness protection program didn't exist at that time, but essentially they had all made deals with the prosecution that if they told what they knew and told it in court, that they would be protected in some way. And that started with this suite in a kind of dilapidated Coney Island hotel where the police set up a protected suite of rooms known as the Rat Suite. And as you say, these informants lived in a kind of limbo. They weren't prisoners, but they weren't exactly free either. And they were all waiting to testify and then somehow disappear into America in some way, those that lived long enough to do that. And they knew that mob assassins were setting up sharpshooters on neighboring buildings at one point. They knew that the mob was going to try every which way to get at them. And so there, as I said earlier, there was a theory that Reles was trying to escape, and that's why he went out the window. Most people would say that's unlikely because the last thing Reles wanted was to be out in the city where he would be vulnerable to the mob assassins.
I thought it was interesting that a lot of these tough guys, once they were confronted and forced to tell what they knew, just fell apart. They were just sobbing. Was this just amateur theatrics, or were they really, at the end of the day, big cowards?
I think it's more the latter than the former. I mean, the code of honor in the Mafia is this term omerta, which means the code of silence. You're not supposed to share anything. And there's a kind of, Italian macho idea about being stoic and silent. But honestly, when these guys were cornered, a lot of the time not all of them, but a lot of them would just crumble. They would just crumble. They would weep. They would tell everything. And sometimes they went a little crazy. I mean, sometimes they kind of legitimately kind of lost their sensibilities under the pressure of all of this.
Did you enjoy writing the book? I would think for a writer, a nonfiction writer in this case, that it's a pretty target-rich environment, writing about the mob.
Oh, yeah. I mean, I just loved it. I mean, how could you not? These characters, Tick-Tock Tannenbaum and, Bugsy Siegel, they're just amazing characters. They're too good to be true. And it's all set against Brooklyn in the 1930s and 1940s. It's just, I just felt like I was in a candy shop with these characters. And every time I stumbled upon something and started to research it, it just opened up some bizarre new line of narrative. It was such a rich world.
Michael Cannell, thanks very much for being with us. Appreciate it.
Hey, this is great, Paul. I really appreciate it.